On the morning of June 6, 1942, the USS Yorktown was still floating. That should not have been possible. The previous afternoon, Japanese carrier aircraft from Hiryu had found her in the open Pacific northeast of Midway and put 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes into her hull. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, had ordered an abandoned ship when she heeled to 26 degrees, and her flight deck was nearly touching the water. 3,000 men went over the side. Destroyers pulled them out of the ocean through the afternoon. But Yorktown did not sink. The damage control teams had done something at Coral Sea the month before that no carrier crew had ever managed. They had kept a carrier alive after that kind of attack, gotten her to Pearl Harbor, and had her back in service in 48 hours when the estimate was 90 days. The men who had done it once knew what to do a second time. Through the night of June 4th into June 5th, a salvage party went back aboard and began fighting the flooding. By the morning of June 6th, the carrier's list had corrected from 26 degrees to 17. She was still afloat. A fleet tug named Vireo had her under tow. The destroyer Hammond had pulled alongside to provide power for the pumps and firefighting capability. The salvage party was back at work. Inside the combined fleet flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto was reading the situation reports. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were all gone. The fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across half the Pacific, had lost 4 carriers in a single afternoon to American dive bombers. The battle was a catastrophe. The invasion of Midway had been called off. Yamamoto was composing the orders that would bring his fleet home. But Yorktown was still floating. Yamamoto sent a signal to the submarine I-168. She was already in the area, having spent the previous days making a nuisance of herself off Midway itself, surfacing at night to shell the island's airfield before being driven back down by searchlights and aircraft. Her orders now were specific. Find a damaged American carrier. Sink her. The man who read those orders was Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Tanabe had been in submarines since 1932. He had worked through the interwar years in a service that the Imperial Japanese Navy treated as secondary to its battleships and carrier aviation. Learning a profession that required a particular kind of sustained attention and a tolerance for the specific discomforts of a cramped steel tube at sea. By 1942, he was 36 years old and had commanded I-168 since the previous year. He had taken her to sea in the Pearl Harbor operation. I-168 was among the submarines assigned to the attack, positioned to intercept American ships fleeing the harbor, though she made no attacks during that engagement. He had sailed her to the waters off Midway and spent 3 days observing the island through the periscope, surfacing at night to report aircraft activity, and once to shell the airfield before searchlights found the scope, and he had to go down. He was not, by the Imperial Navy's own hierarchy of priorities, one of its most celebrated officers. The celebrated men flew aircraft from carriers. Tanabe worked submerged, slowly, in a boat that the Navy's doctrine had positioned as a supporting instrument for fleet rather than a primary weapon. What the Navy had asked of its submarines in the first months of the war was primarily reconnaissance, position reporting, and occasional attacks on whatever naval targets presented themselves. The aggressive independent patrol doctrine that the Americans were developing and that would eventually strangle Japan's supply lines was not yet Japanese policy. What Tanabe had was skill in the specific work of submarine approach, and the order he had received on June 6th was the clearest possible request for that skill. The report that reached him described Yorktown as protected by 6 American destroyers in a tight, circular pattern around the carrier and her tug. 6 destroyers with sonar, with depth charges, with enough crew to maintain watch around the clock. Inside that ring was a carrier that was barely moving, towed by a vessel that was slower than most surface ships walked in calm water. The geometry was, from one angle, straightforward. A submarine at periscope depth, moving slowly, could approach a target that was almost stationary. The challenge was the destroyers and the hours of approach required to get inside them. Tanabe divided 168 before first light on June 6th and began moving toward the position the combined fleet had given him. He was submerged for 6.5 hours. 6.5 hours at periscope depth, moving toward a screen of 6 destroyers. in water where American aircraft had been hunting Japanese submarines for days, using sonar pings that would reach out several miles in every direction from each destroyer. Tanabe's crew, in the cramped spaces of a submarine designed in 1931, waited. The conning tower held 5 officers. They were all sweating. The account Tanabe wrote 21 years later for the United States Naval Institute described the tension building steadily throughout that approach, and described his gunnery Officer Ensign Watanabe as the calmest man in the compartment, because Watanabe's job was the simplest. The range when they finally fired would be point blank. There were no ballistics problems to solve. The target speed was nearly 0, what Tanabe does not linger on. But what the approach time makes clear is a particular quality of stillness required to bring a submarine through a destroyer screen over 6.5 hours. Submarine crews were trained to go still and go deep when detected, to absorb whatever the destroyers dropped on them and wait for the pattern to move away. That was a passive mode. What Tanabe was doing was the active version, moving toward the screen, not away from it, taking the full length of the morning to thread through the pattern of ships that were specifically there to kill him, without touching anything that would announce his presence. His torpedo petty officer sat at his switch panel. The helmsman wiped his hands on his uniform. Tanabe stood with his palms out, waiting for the periscope to rise. Age Party, which had spent hours fighting to correct that list, now had to abandon the effort. Buckmaster made the decision again. Get the men off. The tug Vireo cut her tow line. Hammond was already gone. The Hammonds sinking killed men who should have survived it. She carried depth charges on her racks, armed and set to shallow depth in case a Japanese submarine appeared, which one now had. When Hammond broke apart and went down, her depth charges went with her. At the depth she sank to, several of them detonated. The explosions in the water radiated outward through the ocean and into the bodies of the men who were swimming nearby. Men from Hammond's own crew who had made it over the side before she went down, and men from Yorktown who had already been in the water since the previous afternoon. An underwater explosion at that range did internal damage that a man on the surface couldn't see. It ruptured organs and killed without leaving visible marks. The men who were in the water when Hammond's charges went off died in the ocean from the concussion of their own ship's ammunition. 81 men from Hammond were killed in total. The count of Yorktown's final casualties reached 141 officers and enlisted men. Some of those deaths were from the Hammond's depth charges. Tanabe, 50 feet below the surface of the Pacific, could hear none of this. He knew what his torpedoes had done, and he went deep to absorb what was coming. Tanabe took I-168 down. The destroyers found him almost immediately. For the next 13 hours, they worked the contact, dropping depth charges across the area where the periscope had last appeared, running patterns designed to force a submarine to the surface or to kill it at depth. Tanabe counted 40 charges during those 13 hours. To understand what 40 depth charges over 13 hours means inside a submarine, the relevant fact is not the number, but the pace. A depth charge attack in 1942 operated on a specific rhythm. The destroyer makes a run, drops its charges, turns and listens with sonar for signs of contact, then makes another run. Each run takes several minutes. The wait between runs has a particular character. The crew can hear the destroyer's screws getting louder, track the approach by sound alone, count the seconds from when the charges leave the water to when they explode, and know from the time interval roughly how deep the destroyer's crew has set the fuses. A shallow setting means the charges go off above the boat. A deep setting means they go off below. The crew can feel the difference. Shallow charges make the boat lurch upward. Deep charges make the hull compress from below. A charge close enough on any axis knocks men off their feet and sends anything not secured sliding across the deck. Several of Tanabe's 40 charges were close enough for that. The lights failed. Pipes began leaking. The electric motors that drove the boat while submerged, the motors that had been running continuously since before dawn, took damage. The air inside the hull, which had been cycling through 60 or more men's lungs with the entire approach intact, was becoming difficult to breathe. When the batteries were nearly exhausted, when the choice was surface or die at depth, Tanabe brought I-168 up into the late afternoon sun. 3 American destroyers were 5 miles away. They saw him. One came toward him. Tanabe ran on the surface to charge his batteries and air out the boat, making 14 knots on 2 engines while his crew repaired the electric motor below. He stayed on the surface long enough and moved fast enough that the pursuing destroyer lost him before he could dive again. He surfaced at 8 in the evening. He radioed Yamamoto's flagship Yamato. He reported that he had attacked and sunk Yorktown. He was wrong about the timing. The Yorktown had not sunk yet. The 2 torpedo hits had corrected the carrier's list from 17 degrees back to 26, which was essentially the position she had been in when Buckmaster first ordered abandoned ship. She was still floating. She sank the following morning, June 7, 1942, at 7 minutes past 7. The American ship still in the area watched her go. Every ship that had a clear view lowered its flag to half-mast. All hands who were topside stood at attention with heads uncovered. The accounts from sailors who witnessed it described men crying. Yorktown had fought through Coral Sea and come back. She had made it back from Pearl Harbor to fight at Midway. She had been hit twice by aircraft and had not gone down. She had been torpedoed and had not gone down. She sank in the morning light with the American fleet watching, and the fleet's response was a response of men losing something that should not have been losable. Tanabe did not know this when he sent his signal the previous afternoon. He knew what his torpedoes had done. He knew the carrier had been in serious trouble before he arrived, and that 2 more hits at waterline would finish what the aircraft had started. The report he filed was accurate in its essentials, even if the timing was off by some hours. Yamamoto received the signal on Yamato's bridge. The carrier he had sent the submarine to kill was sinking. The battle was over. 168 reached Yokosuka on June 19th. A crowd was waiting. If you have watched this far, you already understand what made Tanabe's approach possible. Not courage alone, but a specific quality of patience that submarine warfare either builds or eliminates. Subscribe now if this is the kind of story that deserves to be told. It costs nothing, and we will be here when you come back. The Yorktown sinking was the last Japanese success at Midway, and it was a small one measured against the context. The 4 carriers that Yamamoto had sent to the battle were gone. The battle had not gone the way Yamamoto had planned, and the plan had not gone the way Japanese naval strategy had assumed since 1941. The decisive fleet engagement that imperial doctrine required, the single concentrated surface battle in which Japanese gunnery would overwhelm American numbers, had not happened at Midway and would not happen anywhere in the Pacific. What had happened instead was that American aircraft had found the Japanese carriers in the middle of rearming, with fuel hoses running across the hangar decks and bombs being moved from their storage positions. The dive bombers had arrived from 3 directions in a span of 6 minutes and put the 4 carriers on the bottom in a single afternoon. The Yamato, the largest warship ever built, had been present throughout and had not fired her main guns once. The battle had moved at the speed of aircraft, not at the speed of surface ships, and the instrument of the decisive engagement had been a dive bomber, not a gun. Tanabe knew some of this. Every senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew some version of it by the summer of 1942. The question of what it meant for the future was one that different men answered differently. The hard answer, that the carrier had replaced the battleship as a decisive instrument of naval warfare, that the Pacific War would be won by the Navy that could put more aircraft over more ocean at shorter intervals, and that Japan's production capacity could not match America's in that competition, was an answer that some officers understood clearly and others pushed away from because it had no good end. Accepting it completely meant accepting that the outcome of the war was already determined, and military institutions do not easily accommodate that conclusion. The softer answer, that the loss at Midway was catastrophe but a recoverable one, that Japan's remaining carriers and surface fleet were still formidable, that a combination of attrition and decisive engagement could still change the balance, was the answer that the institutional logic of the Imperial Japanese Navy produced. It was the answer that sustained the planning, the training, the expenditure of ships and men for 3 more years. The submarines occupied a particular position in this argument. American submarines were already demonstrating by the summer of 1942 what aggressive independent patrol could do to Japan's supply lines. Japanese submarines, by doctrine and by deployment, were still primarily functioning as fleet support vessels, scouts, transport runners, occasional attackers of naval targets. The gap between how the 2 navies used their submarines was a gap that would widen over the next 3 years and contribute significantly to Japan's material strangulation. The man who came home from Midway understood all of this in whatever form his understanding took, and went back to the work the Navy gave him. I-168 continued her patrols. Tanabe was eventually reassigned. A new commanding officer took the boat. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In the 13 months between Midway and July 1943, I-168 made additional war patrols in the Southwest Pacific. The operational area had expanded as the American advance moved through the Solomon Islands and the Bismarcks, and Japanese submarines in that region were handling an increasing range of tasks. Supply missions to isolated garrisons, troop transport, anti-submarine patrols, and defense of Japanese shipping routes. The American submarine fleet was simultaneously expanding and becoming more aggressive, its commander selected for willingness to attack, and its torpedo defects slowly, painfully, being corrected through the course of 1943. Tanabe left I-168 at some point in this period. The Japanese naval records do not make the timing precise in the accounts available after the war. A new commanding officer took command. The boat went on patrol and came back, as boats do when the war is going badly but is still ongoing, when there are still missions to run and orders to follow. On July 27, 1943, I-168 was in the Bismarck Sea, approximately 60 nautical miles off the northern coast of New Hanover Island. She was on a war patrol. The combined fleet had been operational in that region for months, and the Bismarck Sea had seen significant fighting since the battle there in February 1943 that had devastated a Japanese troop convoy and effectively ended Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons in New Guinea by surface vessel. The waters were contested. Both sides maintained submarine patrols in the area. American submarines have been increasingly effective throughout the year as their torpedoes were corrected and their commanders grew more aggressive. The USS Scamp was also there. Scamp was a Gato-class submarine, commissioned in September 1942, on her third war patrol out of Pearl Harbor under Commander Walter Gale Ebert. She was 27 years old. She had been in submarines since 1940 and had worked through the early patrols when the torpedo problems that plagued the American submarine force had turned his attacks into frustrations, watching what should have been kills bounce off hulls or fail to detonate. By the summer of 1943, those problems were being addressed, and Scamp's third patrol was a different instrument than her first had been. At some point on July 27th, Scamp detected I-168. The accounts of what happened in the next few minutes are sparse. What the records show is this. I-168 fired a torpedo at Scamp. Ebert crash dived his boat under it. The torpedo passed overhead. Ebert brought Scamp back up, tracked I-168's position, and fired a salvo of 4 torpedoes. His torpedoes hit. I-168 went down in the Bismarck Sea on July 27, 1943. All 97 men aboard her were lost. No survivors were recovered. The boat's position has never been precisely determined, and the wreck has not been found. The commanding officer of I-168 on her final patrol did not file a report because he did not come back. His name is not prominently recorded in the accounts of the engagement. The battle between Scamp and I-168 is a footnote in Scamp's patrol records, a note in Japanese naval documents, and the end of a submarine that had briefly been the most celebrated in the Imperial Japanese Navy. There is an account of the Yorktown approach that Tanabe wrote in 1963, 21 years after the battle, published in the United States Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine under the title, I Sank the Yorktown at Midway. The publication itself says something about how the war had been reconsidered by then. A Japanese submarine officer, writing in his own voice about sinking an American carrier, published in the American Naval Institute's flagship journal. The editors chose to run it as a first-person account, not a historical analysis, not a translation with commentary. Tanabe's voice is crew's names, his periscope. It is a document of precision and restraint. Tanabe describes the periscope, the tension in the conning tower, the palm-out waiting posture. He describes Ensign Watanabe's unusual calm. He describes the 6.5 hours of approach with a specificity that comes from a man who had been in that conning tower and who had organized the experience into something he could put in sequence. What the account does not do is claim more than the facts support. Tanabe writes about what he saw through the periscope and what he ordered and what happened when the torpedoes left the tubes. He does not write about what it meant. He does not claim that sinking Yorktown mattered to the outcome of the battle, because he understood that it did not. The battle was over before his torpedoes fired. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone. The invasion of Midway had been canceled. What he had done was give Japan a small, precise act of damage at the end of a catastrophic defeat. And he records in those proportions. The crew members of I-168 who appear in his account are named. Nakagawa with his pencil and compass. Watanabe, the unconcerned gunnery officer. The torpedo petty officer at his switch panel. The helmsman wiping his hands. They are given their jobs and their small details, and their place in the 6.5 hours. That is the kind of record Tanabe kept. He kept it because he came back. He survived the 40 depth charges and the exhausted batteries and the surface run with the destroyer closing behind him. He survived Midway and every patrol afterward that the Navy asked of him before his reassignment. He survived the war itself. In 1963, he sat down and described what had happened in the Bismarck Sea in terms that a reader could follow, and the record exists because the man who made it came home. The men who went down with I-168 in July 1943 have no equivalent record. They were on a war patrol in the Bismarck Sea, and the boat did not come back. And the men who were not aboard I-168 wrote down what they knew about the engagement from the American side and from Japanese naval archives that survived the war. The names of the crew on that final patrol are in some of those archives, in the kind of list that naval administrations kept. They are not otherwise preserved. There is no account from inside the boat. The war in the Pacific ended on September 2nd, 1945. Yahachi Tanabe lived through it. He came home to Japan under American occupation, wrote his account 21 years later, and died in 1979. His 1963 article in USNI Proceedings remains the most detailed first-person account in English of a Japanese submarine attack during the Pacific War. The men he named in it, Nakagawa, Watanabe, the torpedo petty officer, the helmsman, are preserved in that record. The USS Scamp, which had sunk I-168 in July 1943, was herself lost in November 1944 in the Philippine Sea, most likely to a Japanese aircraft attack. 63 men, no survivors. The wreck has not been found. Ebert, her commanding officer when she sank I-168, survived the war. He received the Navy Cross for the I-168 engagement. The Hammond survivors were picked up from the water by other American destroyers. The men who died from Hammond's own depth charges are listed in her casualty records, along with the men killed directly by Tanabe's torpedo. The record does not separate how each man died. They are all listed together. George Grider, who navigated USS Wahoo into Wewak Harbor with a schoolchild's atlas, went to Memphis and practiced law, and voted for the Voting Rights Act. Richard O'Kane, who had pressed his eye to the periscope in that same harbor, commanded USS Tang, survived when Tang was sunk by her own malfunctioning torpedo, spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, came home, and received a Medal of Honor. Dudley Morton, who stood behind the periscope because he trusted the man who was looking, did not return from Wahoo's 7th patrol. 79 men. The record of the Battle of Midway gives I-168 and her crew the credit for sinking the only 2 American warships lost in the battle, Hammond and Yorktown. That credit is accurate. It is also true that the battle was decided in the 6 minutes when American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers, and that everything Tanabe did in the 6.5 hours before he fired, and in the 13 hours he spent under depth charge attack afterward, was done in the context of a battle that had already been lost by the side that sent him. He did his job with a precision that the record preserves. The boat did its patrols for another 13 months after Midway and came home each time until July 27, 1943. The final commanding officer of I-168 did his job too, presumably in the specific waters of the Bismarck Sea on the specific morning of his last patrol, and the record of that work did not come back with him because the record goes down with the crew. That is the last fact about I-168. A submarine is a record-keeping institution. patrol reports, position logs, contact reports, the accumulated paperwork of a warship moving through contested water. When the boat doesn't come back, the papers don't come back either. The approach that Tanabe documented so precisely in 1963 exists because he survived to write it. What happened in the Bismarck, exists only in what the Americans recorded and what the Japanese archives kept from the shore side. 97 men. No account from inside. No report. If you stayed until the end, you understand why the story is told across 2 battles, and 2 years rather than 1. The same boat, different missions. One recorded from the inside because the man who did it came home. One recorded from the outside because nobody else was left. Subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific Submarine Service. On either side, in the years this account covers. The comment section is where those names go. If this sends you somewhere new, we will be here. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Hammond survivors were picked up from the water by other American destroyers. The men who died from Hammond's own depth charges are listed in her casualty records along with the men killed directly by Tanabe's torpedo. The record does not separate how each man died. They are all listed together. George Grider, who navigated USS Wahoo into Wewak Harbor with a schoolchild's atlas, went to Memphis and practiced law, and voted for the Voting Rights Act. Richard O'Kane, who had pressed his eye to the periscope in that same harbor, commanded USS Tang, survived when Tang was sunk by her own malfunctioning torpedo, spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, came home, and received a Medal of Honor. Dudley Morton, who stood behind the periscope because he trusted the man who was looking, did not return from Wahoo's 7th patrol. 79 men. The record of the Battle of Midway gives I-168 and her crew the credit for sinking the only 2 American warships lost in the battle, Hammond and Yorktown. That credit is accurate. It is also true that the battle was decided in the 6 minutes when American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers, and that everything Tanabe did in the 6.5 hours before he fired, and in the 13 hours he spent under depth charge attack afterward, was done in the context of a battle that had already been lost by the side that sent him. He did his job with a precision that the record preserves. The boat did its patrols for another 13 months after Midway and came home each time until July 27, 1943. The final commanding officer of I-168 did his job too, presumably in the specific waters of the Bismarck Sea on the specific morning of his last patrol, and the record of that work did not come back with him because the record goes down with the crew. That is the last fact about I-168. A submarine is a record-keeping institution. Patrol reports, position logs, contact reports, the accumulated paperwork of a warship moving through contested water. When the boat doesn't come back, the papers don't come back either. The approach that Tanabe documented so precisely in 1963 exists because he survived to write it. What happened in the Bismarck, exists only in what the Americans recorded and what the Japanese archives kept from the shore side. 97 men. No account from inside. No report. If you stayed until the end, you understand why the story is told across 2 battles, and 2 years rather than 1. The same boat, different missions. One recorded from the inside because the man who did it came home. One recorded from the outside because nobody else was left. Subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific Submarine Service. On either side, in the years this account covers. The comment section is where those names go. If this sends you somewhere new, we will be here. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.